to start? I don't feel so good.
If he asked me to burn the world...
Be for vegetarian.
Why is it that so many stories leave you feeling empty and bored? The story ends and you just feel nothing. As soon as you drive home or eat dinner or see your friends, you forget that story as easily as if it never happened. It was a meaningless experience. What makes that happen? And how can we prevent that from happening in our own stories? I'm going to share with you 7 major mistakes that writers make to rob their stories of emotional power. Mistake number 1. The characters always make jokes during moments of high emotion. This is a classic problem for so many modern movies. There will be an emotional reveal or seemingly important loss for the characters, but then one of them will crack a joke immediately. In these moments, I think the intention of the author is to give the audience like a momentary release from that high emotion, but in reality, it just makes it so the audience doesn't have to experience the emotion at all. It snatches back that emotional moment and replaces it with levity, which tells the audience that the characters aren't really affected by this, so there's no reason for us to be affected by this. It's as if the writers are afraid to sit with their own emotions, to allow anyone to really feel their emotions. Maybe they think that the emotions are so intolerable to their audience that they can't bear to let them sit with an emotion for any length of time before wiping it away with a quick laugh or remedy. Literally, one of the first things you learn in therapy is how to sit with your emotions, and why it's important not to constantly bury them beneath meaningless quips and artificial comfort. But a lot of times, writers do that very thing during moments of high emotion. They try to rescue the audience before anyone had time to experience any of the emotion. And all that leaves you with is a story that feels flat. The audience isn't allowed to experience any deep emotions because the characters aren't allowed to experience any deep emotions. Constantly being swiped away by jokes and levity. Not that jokes are bad, but if you're constantly putting jokes over top your moments of deep emotion, it's just gonna negate the moments of deep emotion. I think writers are like parents, and we want to protect our characters and our audience from suffering, so when big emotional moments come around, instead of letting the characters sit with that emotion and fully experience it, we swoop in with a joke and erase it. Mustn't let people feel big feelings. But that strategy in life and in writing just removes people's opportunity to feel anything at all, and it leaves them feeling empty and unfulfilled. Mistake number 2. The emotional buildup of the story does not match the emotional release. This can play out in writing in 2 different scenarios. Either characters focus heavily on some aspect of their lives, like a secret they're keeping or some event that they fear happening, and then that thing happens, the secret is found out or the event takes place, and instead of having major life-changing implications for the character, as we were led to believe, the characters are just like, okay. And then they move on as if it never even happened. Or, the second scenario, the emotional buildup of the entire story does not match the actual moments creating emotion within the story. For example, let's say you're writing a romance, but instead of the emotional moments happening between the 2 main characters, the frictions between them, their interpersonal conflict, the story actually presents them as 2 people just perfectly, happily in love, and they never have any tension between them, and all the tense emotional moments of the story come from external sources. Just one thing after another. He gets fired, she fights with her mom, she has a stalker, he's resentful of his brother, but none of the tension actually happens between the 2 main leads. The reason we are even reading this story. The story just becomes like them telling each other about the hard parts of their day without ever actually creating any tension between the 2 characters. And that's just not what we, as the reader, came for. If we're reading a romance, we expect the emotional moments to revolve around that romance. If we're reading a mystery, we expect the emotional moments to revolve around the mystery. But so many stories just sort of forget that and just start sticking in random emotional moments, since the writer has constructed their main plot to be without any tension or conflict at all. Mistake number 3. The characters don't react to any major events. Sometimes, characters can react to emotional moments in a way that undermines the emotion for the audience. But other times, a story will feel flat because the characters don't react at all. They are perfectly stoic throughout everything, no matter what comes their way. There is no emotional buildup, and there is no emotional release. In fact, there is no emotion at all. As an audience, we take our cues from the character. So if the characters aren't reacting with any kind of emotion, then why should we? They're clearly unbothered by these events, so there's no point in us fretting about them. If your story has a stoic character, there has to be some clues to the audience as how they got this way, and what it would take for them to break and start showing emotion again. Then, during the story, we should get to see that happen. The entire story could be about a stoic character, but we are given clues, tiny moments that show the story is actually a build-up, and eventually the character will reach their breaking point, and all their emotions will come out. either in anger or grief or recklessness or whatever makes the most sense for that character. This problem often happens because the author is afraid of becoming melodramatic. Which brings me to the next point. Mistake number 4. The characters overreact to major events. This is the classic reason why emotions fall flat in your story. You write out some dramatic moment and the characters all wail in shock and throw themselves on the floor weeping, and you're thinking this will surely bring the audience to tears. But instead, your audience is just kind of watching your characters like, you know, it's like, have you ever been to a particularly bad stage play and the actor does some wild, over-the-top, uncoordinated dance routine and then stands there panting and waiting for applause? The audience is too stunned and uncomfortable to realize that they're supposed to clap. You want to avoid that in your story if you can. Mistake number 5. There is no time to process the major events of your story before a second major event occurs. So in real life, sometimes terrible things just happen one on top of the other and there's no time to process them. But that's very difficult to capture in a compelling story because it forces the audience to just shove aside all of their emotions and process nothing. Like you would if it was happening to you in your real life. You'd just be in survival mode. And in order for a story to have a lasting impact, the audience needs to have time to sit with and experience the emotions the stories bring up. You can't expect them to process afterwards, to emotionally experience the world of your story once they are no longer in that world. That will never happen if they weren't given time to experience the emotions during the story. You might hope it will, but what will actually end up happening is you throw a bunch of emotional scenes at the audience, one right after the other, without giving them any time to process them, or without giving the characters any time to process them, to show the audience what emotions are even there. And then the audience leaves the story and just brushes it all away. It wasn't actually real events happening in their life, and there is no reason for them to carry it with them, to process later. Now that they've left the world of your story, they have to go back to their real lives and experience their own real emotions. They don't have time for yours. You, as the writer, have to create that time within the story to force the audience to experience the emotional moments while they're still in the world of the story. Then they will carry that experience with them after they leave. Mistake number 6. The characters are inconsistent. Inconsistency can cause a wide array of problems in your story, not just making the emotions feel flat. But essentially, it all boils down to creating a character that the audience doesn't see as real. They are not a real person because they are always reacting differently to events in the story, seemingly just based on what will be the most dramatic at that moment. And that does not feel realistic. In real life, people can be unpredictable, but that emotional unpredictability is a key aspect of their personality. And it can actually make other people in their lives uncomfortable to be around them. That could be a very interesting character to explore in your story, but you need to do it intentionally, and you need to make sure all of the characters weren't experiencing life the same way, because that is definitely unrealistic, unless they're in some kind of support group. You can't just have your characters reacting willy-nilly to the events of your story without any kind of consistency and just expect your audience to understand that all of these characters just happen to struggle with wildly fluctuating emotions, and it also just so happens not to impact their lives in any other way. That's not interesting to read about or watch in a story because it doesn't ring true. It doesn't feel real. A real person won't react to a situation with reserved stoicism and then explode recklessly during other situations. That type of extreme character change has to be earned through the development of your story and the deep character work that you have done to create a character that responds so unpredictably. And that's extremely unlikely to happen if you, the writer, are unaware that your characters are inconsistent. Mistake number 7. The characters are always light and happy no matter what kinds of trauma they experience. So, there is nothing wrong with light and happy. I enjoy a nice light and happy story. If that's the tone that you're going for, that's wonderful. But if that's the case, it would likely feel jarring and unrealistic to throw in the fact that your character's parents were murdered right before their eyes, or they were abducted as a child and nearly killed before a dramatic rescue. These are the types of backstories that have a lasting impact on people. And your happy-go-lucky characters that are able to maintain normal daily function and form and maintain normal relationships, it just doesn't seem to fit. The trauma caused no detriment to their lives. It didn't slow them down at all. It's just merely an interesting story that they tell people. And it's meant to give them depth, but it ultimately just falls flat. Because you're never at a work party and your bubbly coworker just says, "Ah yes, when I was 7, both my parents were murdered in front of me and I was the only survivor. You wanna get coffee tomorrow?" These characters are not dealing with trauma in a realistic way. It's like when a character who is not superhuman gets shot and then is able to continue fighting and running as if nothing is wrong. I've even seen contemporary novels where someone slices their arm so bad they have to get 10 stitches, and then the injury is literally never mentioned again. It does not slow them down. They just go on with their daily activities as if there is not an open wound on their arm with threads constantly tugging at their skin. If you've ever had stitches, you know what I mean. That feeling of tugging is extremely unnerving, like your skin might rip apart at any moment. Even if medically that's unlikely to happen, that sick tugging feeling still keeps you from moving as freely throughout your day as you normally would. If you're writing a character who gets stitches, and you've never had stitches, it would be important to research the aftercare for wounds, and also common experiences that people deal with while waiting for their wounds to heal. The same is true for writing emotion. If you're writing a character deep in grief, but you've never experienced a loss that's quite that severe, you really need to research what grief actually looks like. Not just reading about the stages of grief and how that manifests in different people, but also by reading real accounts of grief that people wrote in the moment as they were experiencing. Typically, blogs can do this exceptionally well, to give you a real-life insight into what someone really feels when they're grieving an extreme loss. Or if you feel really comfortable and have close relationships with someone who experienced that type of grief, you could ask them how it manifested in their life, how they've dealt with the grief and what it looks like even to this day. And not just pangs of sadness or that initial scream of shock, but the emptiness, the anger, the loss of interest in eating or showering. Big emotions like grief aren't just a one-time thing. It's not just to throw yourself down on the bed wailing and then the next morning you're fine. They change you fundamentally as a person for an extended period of time. Perhaps even the rest of your life. You really do enter a new reality, and it's unrealistic to assume that a person would be able to switch from extreme grief to their old bubbly personality at the drop of a hat. When characters are written that way, their emotions don't ring true. They fall flat.